What happens when the place where people go to heal becomes a gateway to unspeakable horror? When the sterile corridors designed to save lives transform into conduits for the dead who refuse to rest? What if the electronic beeping of life support machines isn't the only sound echoing through hospital halls at 3 a.m.? These aren't questions from a Hollywood script. They're the terrifying realities faced by medical professionals who've witnessed firsthand that some patients never truly leave, and some healing never comes. The first sign that something was fundamentally wrong at St. Mary's General Hospital in rural Ohio came on a Tuesday night in March 1994, when night shift nurse Patricia Williams heard a child crying in the pediatric ward. This wouldn't have been unusual, except that the pediatric ward had been closed for renovations for 3 weeks, and no children had been admitted to the hospital in over a month. Patricia had been working at St. Mary's for 15 years, long enough to know every sound the old building made, every creak and groan of the aging infrastructure. She'd worked through power outages, equipment failures, and medical emergencies that would have broken newer staff members. But as she stood in the empty hallway at 2:47 a.m., listening to the unmistakable sound of a child sobbing somewhere in the darkness beyond the construction barriers, she felt something she'd never experienced in all her years of nursing. Pure, primal terror. The pediatric ward was located on the 3rd floor of the hospital's east wing, accessible through a set of double doors that had been sealed with plastic sheeting and warning tape. The renovation project was extensive: new flooring, updated electrical systems, fresh paint, and modern equipment installations. The entire floor had been gutted down to the bare walls, leaving nothing but exposed beams, dangling wires, and the skeletal remains of what had once been rooms where sick children fought for their lives. Patricia approached the sealed entrance slowly, her footsteps echoing unnaturally loud in the empty corridor. The crying grew louder as she drew closer, accompanied now by what sounded like whispered voices and the faint but unmistakable squeak of wheelchair wheels rolling across bare concrete. She pressed her ear to the plastic sheeting, and the sound stopped immediately. Complete absolute silence fell over the 3rd floor, as if someone had suddenly thrown a switch. Patricia waited, barely breathing, straining to hear anything that might explain what she'd experienced. After several minutes of nothing but the distant hum of the hospital's ventilation system, she convinced herself that exhaustion and stress were playing tricks on her mind. But as she turned to walk back to the nurse's station, the crying resumed. This time it was joined by other sounds that made Patricia's blood freeze: the electronic beeping of monitors that had been disconnected weeks ago, the hydraulic hiss of automatic doors that had been removed, and underneath it all, a low moaning that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Patricia ran. For the first time in her 15-year career, she abandoned her post and fled to the security office on the 1st floor, where she found night guard Marcus Chen reviewing surveillance footage from the day shift. "Marcus, I need you to check the cameras on the 3rd floor," Patricia gasped, still out of breath from her panicked flight down 2 flights of stairs. Marcus looked up from his monitors with concern. Patricia was known throughout the hospital as unflappable, the kind of nurse who could handle any crisis with calm professionalism. Seeing her visibly shaken was deeply unsettling. "The 3rd floor?" Marcus asked. "That's all construction zone. The cameras up there were disconnected when the renovation started. Please just check, there has to be something." Marcus pulled up the hospital's security system, scrolling through the available camera feeds. He was right. The 3rd floor cameras showed nothing but black screens. But as he scrolled past the 2nd floor feeds, both he and Patricia saw something that made them question their sanity. On monitor 7, which showed the 2nd floor east corridor directly below the sealed pediatric ward, they could see what appeared to be shadows moving across the ceiling. Not shadows cast by objects or people, but shadows that moved independently, flowing like liquid darkness across the acoustic tiles. "That's impossible," Marcus whispered, adjusting the camera controls to get a better view. "There's nothing up there to cast shadows. The lights aren't even connected yet." As they watched, the shadows began to take more defined shapes. Patricia gripped Marcus's shoulder as they witnessed what looked like the silhouettes of children moving across the ceiling. Some walking, some crawling, others appearing to float. The shadows moved with purpose, as if they were searching for something or someone. "How long has the pediatric ward been closed?" Marcus asked, his voice barely audible. 3 weeks, Patricia replied. "But Marcus, children died in that ward. Over the years, we lost a lot of kids up there." Marcus had worked security at St. Mary's for only 2 years, but he'd heard the stories whispered among the night staff. The pediatric ward had one of the highest mortality rates in the state, not due to negligence or poor care, but because it served as the regional center for the most critical pediatric cases. Children arrived there when other hospitals couldn't help them, when their conditions were too complex or too advanced for smaller facilities. Over the course of 30 years, hundreds of children had died in that ward. Some had succumbed to cancer, others to rare genetic disorders, accidents, or conditions so unusual they didn't have names. The medical staff had done everything possible to save them, but sometimes medicine wasn't enough. Sometimes all they could do was make the end as peaceful as possible. But if the shadows on the security monitor were any indication, not all of those children had found peace. The next morning, Patricia submitted a formal report to the hospital administration, describing what she'd witnessed. She expected skepticism, possibly even disciplinary action for abandoning her post. Instead, she found that her experience wasn't unique. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the hospital's chief administrator, called Patricia into her office and closed the door. "Patricia, I'm going to share something with you that can't leave this room. What you experienced last night isn't the first incident we've had since the renovation began." Dr. Mitchell opened a thick file folder and spread its contents across her desk. The documents detailed dozens of similar reports from staff members across all 3 shifts. Nurses reported hearing children crying in areas where no children were present. Custodial staff described finding toys in rooms that had been empty and locked. Security guards reported elevators stopping at the 3rd floor despite being programmed to skip it during construction. Most disturbing of all were the reports from the construction crew. Workers had been complaining for weeks about equipment malfunctions, tools that moved on their own, and an overwhelming sense of being watched while they worked. 3 members of the crew had quit without explanation, refusing to return to the job site even when offered substantial bonuses. "We've brought in a consultant," Dr. Mitchell continued. "Someone who specializes in unusual situations like this. She's arriving tomorrow morning to conduct an assessment." The consultant turned out to be Dr. Rebecca Cross, a parapsychologist from Ohio State University, who had spent 20 years investigating reported hauntings in institutional settings. Dr. Cross was a small woman in her 50s with graying hair and an intense analytical gaze that seemed to take in every detail of her surroundings. "Hospitals are unique environments when it comes to paranormal activity," Dr. Cross explained to the assembled staff during an emergency meeting. "The combination of intense emotional experiences, traumatic events, and the thin line between life and death creates what we call psychic imprints in the physical space." She went on to describe how these imprints could manifest as unexplained phenomena, particularly when the environment was disrupted by construction or renovation. "It's as if the reconstruction process awakens dormant energy that's been absorbed by the building over decades of human suffering and healing." Dr. Cross spent 3 days at St. Mary's, interviewing staff members, reviewing historical records, and conducting what she called environmental assessments throughout the hospital. On her final day, she requested access to the sealed pediatric ward. Patricia volunteered to accompany Dr. Cross along with Marcus and Dr. Mitchell. Together, they cut through the plastic sheeting and entered the construction zone that had once been a place of healing and hope. The pediatric ward was unrecognizable. Walls had been torn down to create larger spaces, ceiling tiles had been removed to expose the building's skeleton, and decades of accumulated memories had been literally stripped away. But as soon as they stepped through the entrance, everyone felt it, an oppressive heaviness in the air, as if the space itself was grieving. Dr. Cross moved through the gutted rooms with scientific precision, taking photographs and measurements with various electronic devices. But in what had once been room 312, she stopped abruptly and set down her equipment. "This room," she said quietly. "Something significant happened here." Patricia checked her notes from the hospital's records. Room 312 had been where the most critically ill pediatric patients were treated. According to the files, 47 children had died in that room over the course of 3 decades, more than any other single room in the hospital. As Dr. Cross examined the space more closely, the temperature began to drop noticeably. Their breath became visible in the suddenly frigid air, and the electronic equipment began to malfunction. EMF detectors that had been reading normal levels suddenly spiked off the charts, and digital cameras started displaying images of empty rooms filled with what appeared to be dozens of children. But it was the audio recordings that provided the most disturbing evidence. Dr. Cross's sensitive microphones picked up layers of sound that weren't audible to the human ear. Children's voices calling for their parents, medical equipment that was no longer present, and most chillingly, the voice of a nurse reading bedtime stories to patients who were no longer there. "They're not malevolent," Dr. Cross explained as they reviewed the evidence later that evening. "These are the spirits of children who died before they were ready, and they're confused about why their familiar environment has been destroyed. The renovation has disrupted their sense of place and belonging." Dr. Mitchell asked the question that everyone was thinking: what do we do about it? Dr. Cross's recommendation was unprecedented. She suggested that the hospital acknowledge the presence of the children's spirits and create a memorial space within the renovated ward. "Give them recognition," she advised. "Let them know they haven't been forgotten." The hospital administration was skeptical, but the paranormal activity was beginning to affect patient care in other parts of the building. Elevators malfunctioned regularly, electronic equipment failed without explanation, and staff members were becoming increasingly reluctant to work night shifts. Something had to be done. The memorial garden was installed in what had been the ward's central playroom. A beautiful stained glass window depicted children at play, surrounded by engraved plaques bearing the names of every child who had died in the pediatric ward over its 30-year history. The space was designed to be peaceful and healing, a place where families could remember their lost children and where the spirits could find the recognition they sought. The plan worked, at least initially. The paranormal activity decreased significantly after the memorial was installed, and staff members reported feeling more comfortable working in the renovated areas. The pediatric ward reopened 6 months later, more modern and efficient than ever before. But the peace didn't last. Dr. Amanda Foster was the newly appointed head of pediatric oncology, recruited from Children's Hospital of Philadelphia to lead St. Mary's expanded pediatric program. She was a brilliant physician with an impeccable reputation and a deep commitment to saving children's lives. She was also a complete skeptic when it came to supernatural phenomena. "I don't believe in ghosts," Dr. Foster declared during her first staff meeting. "I believe in medicine, science, and evidence-based treatment. Whatever happened during the renovation was probably just a combination of old building problems and overactive imaginations." Dr. Foster's first few weeks at St. Mary's went smoothly. The new pediatric ward was state-of-the-art, with the latest equipment and technology. Patient outcomes improved dramatically, and the staff began to regain confidence in their facility. But Dr. Foster's skepticism would be tested in ways she couldn't have imagined. The first incident occurred on a Thursday night in November. Dr. Foster was working late, reviewing case files in her new office, when she heard what sounded like children playing in the hallway. This was unusual because all the pediatric patients were asleep, and visiting hours had ended hours earlier. She stepped into the corridor and found it empty and quiet. The nurse's station was staffed but showed no sign of concern about noise in the ward. Dr. Foster returned to her office, but within minutes the sounds resumed: laughter, footsteps, and what sounded like toys being moved around. This pattern continued for several nights. Dr. Foster would hear children playing when the ward should have been quiet, but whenever she investigated, she found nothing unusual. She began to wonder if the building's ventilation system was carrying sounds from other floors, or if she was simply overworked and imagining things. But on the following Tuesday night, Dr. Foster encountered something that couldn't be explained by acoustics or fatigue. She was making rounds, checking on her patients before heading home, when she entered room 312, the same room where Dr. Cross had recorded the most intense paranormal activity. The room was occupied by a 7-year-old girl named Emma, who was receiving treatment for acute lymphoblastic leukemia. Emma was sleeping peacefully when Dr. Foster entered, her vital signs stable and her IV running properly. But as Dr. Foster approached the bed to check Emma's chart, the child's eyes opened. "The other kids want to meet you," Emma said in a voice that seemed too mature for her age. "What other kids?" Dr. Foster asked, assuming Emma was referring to other patients in the ward. "The kids who don't have bodies anymore," Emma replied matter-of-factly. "They've been waiting for a new doctor to talk to. They want to tell you about the medicine that doesn't work." Dr. Foster felt a chill run down her spine. Emma was heavily sedated and shouldn't have been coherent enough for conversation. More disturbing was the child's matter-of-fact reference to dead children, as if she'd been having regular conversations with them. "Emma, you're very sick, and the medication can sometimes cause confusion," Dr. Foster explained gently. "There aren't any other children here right now." Emma smiled sadly. "They're here all the time. They try to help the new kids not be scared, but they're worried about the medicine you're giving everyone." Before Dr. Foster could respond, Emma's eyes closed and she returned to deep sleep. Her vital signs remained stable, and there was no indication that she'd been awake or coherent moments earlier. Dr. Foster documented the incident as medication-induced delirium, but Emma's words haunted her. The next morning, she reviewed the treatment protocol she'd implemented since arriving at St. Mary's. Everything was standard, evidence-based care that had proven successful at her previous hospital. There was no reason to believe any of her treatments were problematic. But over the following weeks, more children began making similar comments. 8-year-old Michael told his nurse that the ghost kids were worried about the new IV medicine. 6-year-old Sarah asked her parents why the invisible children were crying about the yellow pills. 4-year-old David drew pictures of children without faces standing around his hospital bed, watching the doctors. Most disturbing of all, the children's comments seemed to contain medical knowledge they shouldn't have possessed. They mentioned specific drug names, described side effects they hadn't experienced, and showed understanding of treatment protocols that were far beyond their age level. Dr. Foster began to investigate more carefully, reviewing patient records and treatment outcomes since the ward's reopening. What she discovered made her question everything she thought she knew about medicine and the supernatural. The mortality rate in the new pediatric ward was higher than it should have been. Not dramatically higher, but statistically significant enough to warrant investigation. More troubling was the pattern of deaths. Several children had died from complications that seemed unrelated to their primary diagnoses, and in each case the complications had developed suddenly and without warning. Dr. Foster requested detailed autopsies on the recent deaths, despite objections from the hospital administration, who were concerned about negative publicity. The results were puzzling and disturbing. The autopsies revealed that several children had died from adverse reactions to medications that should have been safe for their age and condition. But the most shocking discovery was that some of the children had traces of medications in their systems that hadn't been prescribed or administered by any member of the medical staff. Drugs that had been used in pediatric treatment decades earlier, many of which were now known to be dangerous or ineffective. Dr. Foster found herself facing an impossible situation. The evidence suggested that someone was administering unauthorized medications to her patients, but security footage showed no unauthorized access to the medication storage areas. The nursing staff were all experienced professionals with impeccable records. There was no logical explanation for how outdated and dangerous drugs were getting into her patients' systems. It was Patricia Williams, the veteran nurse who had first reported paranormal activity during the renovation, who provided the theory that Dr. Foster didn't want to believe. "Doctor," Patricia said during a private meeting in Dr. Foster's office, "what if the children who died here over the years are trying to protect the new patients from making the same mistakes that killed them?" The theory was absurd, but it fit the facts better than any rational explanation. The ghost children, if they existed, would remember the medications that had failed to save them. They might be trying to communicate warnings about treatments that had proved fatal in the past. Dr. Foster decided to test this impossible hypothesis. She began researching the medical histories of children who had died in room 312 over the previous 3 decades. What she discovered was a pattern of medical errors, experimental treatments, and pharmaceutical protocols that had since been proven dangerous. Many of the children who had died in the original pediatric ward had been given medications that were later found to cause the exact complications that were now appearing in her current patients. The ghost children weren't trying to harm anyone. They were trying to prevent other children from suffering the same fate they had endured. Armed with this knowledge, Dr. Foster made radical changes to her treatment protocols. She eliminated several medications that had been linked to deaths in the historical records, even though these drugs were still considered standard treatment. She increased monitoring for specific complications that had proved fatal to children decades earlier. Most importantly, she began listening when her young patients mentioned warnings from their invisible friends. The results were immediate and undeniable. The mortality rate in the pediatric ward dropped to well below national averages. Complications became rare, and recovery times improved dramatically. Children who should have died according to statistical models defied the odds and went home to their families. But Dr. Foster's success came with a price. The supernatural activity in the ward increased significantly as more children survived their treatments. Staff members reported seeing apparitions of children in the hallways, playful spirits who seemed to be celebrating the survival of their living counterparts. The activity wasn't malevolent, but it was undeniably present. Toys moved on their own, drawings appeared on walls overnight, and children reported playing games with friends that only they could see. The memorial garden became a focal point for activity, with flowers appearing daily, despite no one admitting to placing them there. Dr. Foster found herself in the unprecedented position of having to manage both a medical unit and a supernatural phenomenon. She established protocols for dealing with paranormal encounters, trained her staff to work alongside invisible presences, and most importantly, learned to view the ghost children as valuable consultants rather than frightening intrusions. The transformation of St. Mary's Pediatric Ward became a case study in adaptive medicine. Dr. Foster published papers on environmental factors in pediatric treatment outcomes, carefully avoiding direct references to supernatural phenomena while documenting the dramatic improvement in patient survival rates. But the full story remained known only to those who worked in the ward and experienced the daily reality of medicine, practiced in partnership with the spirits of children who refused to let other children die from preventable causes. Emma, the 7-year-old who had first mentioned the other kids, became Dr. Foster's most valuable translator. As she recovered from her leukemia treatment, Emma developed an ability to communicate clearly with the spirit children and relay their warnings to the medical staff. "They want you to know that the red medicine makes kids throw up too much," Emma would report, "and the blue pills make their heads hurt really bad." Following Emma's translations of the spirit's warnings, Dr. Foster consistently avoided treatments that would have caused serious complications. Emma became an unofficial member of the medical team, and her insights proved more valuable than any diagnostic equipment. Other children in the ward began displaying similar abilities, as if proximity to the spirit children enhanced their own intuitive understanding of their medical conditions. Parents initially worried about their children's claims of playing with invisible friends, but when they saw the remarkable recovery rates, many began to view the ghost children as guardian angels. The media eventually caught wind of the unusual success rate at St. Mary's Pediatric Ward. Reporters arrived expecting to find a story about medical innovation or exceptional staff, but they encountered something far more complex and inexplicable. Dr. Foster became skilled at redirecting questions away from supernatural explanations, while still acknowledging the unique atmosphere of her ward. "We've created an environment where children feel safe and supported," she would explain. "Sometimes healing requires more than just medicine." But off the record, in private conversations with trusted colleagues, Dr. Foster began to share the true nature of her success. Word spread through the medical community about the miracle ward, where children who communicated with spirits had the best survival rates in the country. Other hospitals began requesting consultations, hoping to replicate St. Mary's success. Dr. Foster found herself in the unusual position of teaching medical professionals how to recognize and work with supernatural phenomena in clinical settings. The success of the pediatric ward had unexpected consequences throughout the rest of St. Mary's Hospital. Other departments began experiencing their own paranormal phenomena, as if the acceptance of spirit presence in the pediatric ward had opened doors throughout the building. In the cardiac unit, nurses reported that deceased patients sometimes returned to comfort family members during difficult decisions about end-of-life care. The emergency department staff noticed that trauma victims often mentioned being guided by invisible helpers during critical moments. Most remarkably, the hospital's overall mortality rate began to improve across all departments. It was as if acknowledging the presence of spirits in one area had created a hospital-wide network of deceased patients who continued to care about the welfare of the living. Dr. Mitchell, the hospital administrator who had first brought in the parapsychologist, found herself managing the most unusual medical facility in Ohio. St. Mary's had become a place where conventional medicine worked in harmony with supernatural guidance, producing results that defied scientific explanation. The hospital's reputation spread beyond the medical community. Families from across the country began requesting transfers to St. Mary's, particularly for children with terminal diagnoses. The waiting list for the pediatric ward grew to months, as parents hoped their children might benefit from what some called divine intervention and others termed collaborative healing. But success brought scrutiny from skeptical medical boards and regulatory agencies. Dr. Foster found herself defending treatment protocols that couldn't be fully explained in scientific journals. How could she document that medication choices were influenced by communications from deceased children? The solution came from Dr. Cross, the parapsychologist who had first investigated the hospital's paranormal activity. She proposed a formal research study to document the relationship between supernatural phenomena and medical outcomes at St. Mary's. The study, approved by the hospital's ethics board and supported by grants from several medical foundations, was the first of its kind. It would attempt to measure the impact of acknowledged paranormal activity on patient care and recovery rates. Over the course of 2 years, Dr. Cross and her team documented hundreds of incidents of supernatural guidance in patient care. They recorded Emma's translations of spirit warnings, tracked treatment modifications based on paranormal input, and measured the statistical improvement in patient outcomes. The results were undeniable. Patients in the spiritually active areas of the hospital had significantly better survival rates, shorter recovery times, and fewer complications than comparable patients in conventional medical facilities. The presence of cooperative spirits appeared to create a therapeutic environment that enhanced the effectiveness of traditional medical treatment. But the study also revealed disturbing aspects of the supernatural activity at St. Mary's. Not all spirits were benevolent helpers interested in healing. Dr. Cross identified several malevolent presences that seemed to feed off suffering and actively worked to prevent recovery. These dark entities appeared to be attracted by the concentration of supernatural activity in the hospital. Drawn to a place where the boundary between life and death had become permeable, they manifested as sudden equipment failures during critical procedures, unexplained medication errors, and overwhelming feelings of despair that affected both patients and staff. Dr. Foster found herself fighting a two-front war, using beneficial spirit guidance to save lives while simultaneously protecting her patients from malevolent supernatural attacks. She developed protocols for identifying and banishing harmful entities, working with Dr. Cross to create a system of spiritual triage alongside medical triage. The pediatric ward's ghost children became valuable allies in this fight. They seemed able to identify malevolent spirits and warn the staff about supernatural threats. Emma and other sensitive children reported that the helper kids worked constantly to keep the scary shadows away from sick patients. This battle between benevolent and malevolent supernatural forces played out daily in the corridors of St. Mary's, invisible to most but critically important to patient outcomes. Dr. Foster learned to recognize the signs of supernatural interference and developed countermeasures that combined medical intervention with spiritual protection. The hospital installed electromagnetic field generators in critical care areas based on Dr. Cross's research showing that certain frequencies disrupted malevolent supernatural activity. Mirrors were strategically placed throughout the facility, as reflective surfaces seemed to confuse hostile spirits. Most importantly, the beneficial spirits were formally acknowledged and thanked for their protection, strengthening their ability to defend patients from supernatural harm. These measures proved effective, but they also attracted attention from religious groups who viewed the hospital's practices as either miraculous or blasphemous. Protesters gathered outside St. Mary's, some demanding access to the miracle healing, while others condemned the facility for trafficking with demons. Dr. Foster found herself navigating not only medical and supernatural challenges, but also religious and political controversies. She testified before medical boards, spoke at religious conferences, and defended her practices to skeptical colleagues who questioned her sanity. Through it all, the children in the pediatric ward continued to recover at unprecedented rates. Emma, now in complete remission from her leukemia, remained in the hospital as a volunteer translator, helping new patients communicate with the spirit children who had saved her life. The ghost children had evolved from confused spirits seeking recognition into an organized network of supernatural medical consultants. They monitored new admissions, identified potential complications before they developed, and guided treatment decisions through their communications with living patients. Dr. Foster documented case after case of miraculous recoveries that could be traced directly to warnings from the spirit children. Children who should have died from aggressive cancers went into unexpected remission after avoiding treatments that the ghosts identified as harmful. Surgical complications were prevented by last-minute changes in procedure based on supernatural guidance. The success was remarkable, but it came with an emotional cost. Dr. Foster had to accept that her medical training was insufficient to understand fully what was happening in her ward. She was practicing medicine in partnership with forces that science couldn't explain, using knowledge that came from sources no medical school had prepared her for. More challenging was the responsibility of managing relationships with spirit children who had died tragically and continued to carry the emotional trauma of their deaths. The ghost children were not just medical consultants, they were still children, with all the needs and vulnerabilities that entailed. Dr. Foster found herself providing psychological support to spirits who had been dead for decades, but remained emotionally frozen at the age they had died. She organized activities that allowed the ghost children to continue playing and learning, creating an afterlife environment that supported their continued development. The memorial garden was expanded to include a playground designed for both living and spirit children. Observers often reported seeing swings moving on their own, toys being manipulated by invisible hands, and the sound of children laughing when no living children were present. This integration of the living and dead created a unique therapeutic environment where dying children could be comforted by those who had gone before them, and where survival was enhanced by supernatural guidance. Families who initially feared their children's reports of invisible playmates learned to view these relationships as sources of strength and healing. The success of St. Mary's Pediatric Ward established a new paradigm in medical care, one that acknowledged supernatural phenomena as potentially valuable components of the healing process. Other hospitals began consulting with Dr. Foster and Dr. Cross, hoping to replicate the success by embracing, rather than ignoring, paranormal activity in their facilities. But replication proved difficult. The supernatural activity at St. Mary's had developed over decades, built on a foundation of tragedy, acceptance, and mutual cooperation between the living and dead. Simply acknowledging the existence of spirits was not enough. Successful supernatural-assisted medicine required building relationships with specific entities who had demonstrated beneficial intent. Dr. Foster traveled to hospitals across the country, teaching medical professionals how to identify and work with helpful supernatural presences while protecting patients from harmful ones. Her methods were unorthodox, but her results were undeniable. The field of supernatural medicine grew slowly, limited by skepticism from medical authorities and resistance from religious groups. But for families whose children had been saved by spirit guidance at St. Mary's, the reality of collaborative healing between the living and dead was unquestionable. Emma, now a teenager, continued working as a translator and advocate for both living patients and spirit children. She had developed her abilities to the point where she could communicate with supernatural entities throughout the hospital, serving as a bridge between the medical staff and their invisible consultants. Under Emma's guidance, the hospital established formal protocols for supernatural consultation in medical decision-making. Charts included notes about spirit warnings, treatment plans were modified based on otherworldly advice, and medical rounds included input from deceased former patients who continued to care about healing outcomes. The transformation was complete. St. Mary's had evolved from a conventional medical facility into something unprecedented in modern healthcare. It was a place where death was not the end of caring, where the wisdom of those who had died could still save lives, and where medicine worked in partnership with forces beyond scientific understanding. But perhaps most importantly, it was a place where children who died too young could find purpose and peace by helping other children survive. The ghost children of St. Mary's had transformed their own tragedy into triumph, their deaths into ongoing missions of healing that continued to save lives decades after their own had ended. The pediatric ward had become more than a medical facility. It was proof that love, compassion, and the desire to heal could transcend death itself. The children who had died there had found a way to ensure that their suffering would prevent other children from experiencing the same fate. Dr. Foster often stood in the memorial garden, watching living children play alongside invisible friends, knowing that she was witnessing something that redefined the very nature of medicine and healing. The ghost children had taught her that some patients never stop fighting for life, even after their own lives have ended. Years had passed since that first night when Patricia Williams heard crying in the empty pediatric ward. What had begun as unexplained supernatural activity had evolved into a revolutionary approach to medical care that saved lives through collaboration between the living and the dead. The children's spirits had found their peace not through moving on to whatever comes after death, but through continuing to serve as guardians and guides for those who followed in their footsteps. They had transformed a place of tragedy into a beacon of hope, proving that even in death, the desire to heal and protect could continue to make a difference. St. Mary's General Hospital stood as testament to the possibility that medicine could evolve beyond the purely physical, that healing could incorporate elements of the supernatural, and that the dead could continue to serve the living in ways that defied all conventional understanding. The ghost children had shown that some spirits choose to remain not out of inability to move on, but out of love too strong to be conquered by death itself. In the end, the haunted hospital had become something far more beautiful than anyone could have imagined. A place where the boundary between life and death dissolved in service of healing, where tragedy was transformed into triumph, and where children who had lost their own battle against illness continued fighting to ensure that other children might win theirs. The crying that had once echoed through empty corridors had been replaced by laughter that bridged the gap between worlds, and the spirits that had once sought recognition had found their purpose in the ongoing mission of saving lives. St. Mary's had become proof that some hauntings are not about torment or unfinished business, but about love that refuses to be limited by the boundaries of death. Have you ever wondered what other supernatural mysteries might be hiding in hospitals across America? What unexplained phenomena are medical professionals witnessing, but afraid to report? If this account of ghostly healing and supernatural medicine has opened your mind to possibilities beyond conventional understanding, subscribe to our channel for more investigations into the paranormal forces that may be shaping our world in ways we never imagined. Share your own hospital experiences or supernatural encounters in the comments below. Sometimes the most incredible stories come from those who've lived them firsthand.